All right, the recording has started, and this is the October 12th, 2020 Crossplane Community Meeting. The big news from last week is that 0.13 was released at the end of the week there on Friday. So that was a great effort from the team to get out a release that had a lot of functionality and updates in it. Nick or Dan, or do you want to talk through some of the big themes there? I wrote them down here, but you all put a lot of work into it. So if you want to talk through it, then please go ahead.
Sure, I'll give some updates on the packaging part of it at least. So I guess the biggest part was replacing the package manager that was existing, which involved a couple of different things. One of them being that the package format was redesigned to be much leaner packages, and another being that configuration packages were introduced. So now you can bundle up kind of all of your composition resources and install those as a package, just like you do a provider. Another thing as part of that is that we aren't unpacking packages in a pod. We're actually downloading the layer contents directly, which makes it a lot faster to install things, and also provides some other different functionality as well. And we actually cache those in a volume that's mounted on the Crossplane pod. There's also the Crossplane CLI that was, I guess, reintroduced. We've had a CLI that was kind of some bash scripts that did some basic functionality, but now the CLI will actually do things like build packages for you, which are very lean OCI containers under the hood. And there's some great documentation on that the team worked on last week that should kind of show you how you can use some of these new features, and gives you a little bit of a common path to using them. So, before we had provisioning resources as managed resources just directly, and then using composition and then running applications with OAM. And now we also have a packaging section on top of that, which shows you how you can kind of package up those compositions you were previously building. And the docs are also a lot more streamlined because we can just install a package as an OCI image instead of creating those resources directly. Nick, did you want to talk a little bit about the Rbac Manager, since you did most of the work on that?
Yeah, sure. Let me know if my internet's working okay. I'm noticing other people are breaking up a little bit. I think it might be my end. So previously in Crossplane, we had some opinions about how Rbac roles were managed. We tried to mirror roughly what upstream Kubernetes does, with regards to having some cluster roles that you can use, admin, view, and edit, that we didn't give them to anyone out of the box, but we created those cluster roles that we would automatically try and group Crossplane types as appropriate resources under those Rbac roles. So for instance, if you give someone the Crossplane admin role, they'll get access to everything that Crossplane does in the cluster, all of Crossplane's types and all the things installed by providers or by the package manager specifically, historically. We also go sort of one step further than Kubernetes, and we've done this at the namespace level as well. So we would actually create a series of cluster roles, somewhat oddly for technical reasons, for each namespace. And we would have admin, view, and edit for those namespaces, so that you could sort of give someone admin within a namespace to Crossplane resources, for example, like claims or classes or whatever it's appropriate, depending on what level it is. So we refactored this in the latest release for two reasons. One was because we wanted it to apply to composition even if you didn't create composition, even if you didn't create composite resources via the package manager. So previously, all of the Rbac was handled by the package manager. So if you didn't install something as a package, we couldn't handle Rbac for you. That's still true for providers. If you go and so we do Rbac for two things: providers and composite resources. If you install a provider somehow without using the package manager, if you just go and run the deployment, then you sort of got to handle Rbac yourself. But if you use the package manager, we'll automatically make sure Crossplane has access to create all of the types that the provider's installed. We'll make sure the provider has access to reconcile all the types that it has installed, all the CRDs. And we'll make sure the admin view edit groups or cluster roles can be bound to groups that can do things at those appropriate levels. So two nice properties about this change are, one, core Crossplane, or the package manager specifically, used to run as cluster admin to enable this. It does not run as cluster admin anymore. In fact, the package manager it doesn't exist as a separate process anymore. It's part of the core Crossplane deployment. The Rbac Manager only manages Rbac, exists as a separate process, and instead of using cluster admin, uses Rbac escalation. So it's still a little bit of a security risk, but it's not the same as giving the process root. It has access to grant itself and other people access that it doesn't have. And the Rbac Manager is optional, which means you can still have packages support, you can still have Crossplane support, you can turn off the Rbac Manager and not deploy it if you don't feel comfortable with Crossplane Manager. So every time you create a composite resource, you've got to go create a cluster role to allow the composite or provider. Another final little change with that, we still make a set of roles for every namespace, but we now make, as you probably would expect if you're used to Kubernetes Rbac, we now make namespace roles for bases rather than making cluster roles for them. That's about it.
Cool. And then also maybe Nick, do you want to talk about some of the composition experience that was updated, like infrastructure definition and moving those to composition resource definitions?
Yeah, definitely. Folks probably there's been a lot of previews of this, and it's actually been in the code base in master for a while. So I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have sort of know what I'm going to say already. Composition has actually quite a long design history. We've been thinking about the functionality since at least late last year, I think. So it took a long time to get into the code base and to get to a place that we feel comfortable with. It initially started out in its design. This was sort of back when Crossplane went through a focusing recently, where we decided that we really sort of wanted to basically go all in on this sort of model where you have providers, maybe mostly for infrastructure. Most people think of sort of Google, Amazon, Azure, Alibaba, etc., as sort of the providers, or in future, VMware, things like that. But we also have the Helm provider now. We have providers that sort of are doing maybe what you might think of as applications or workloads more than sort of strict infrastructure in the sense of sort of databases, networks, all that kind of stuff. So previously, Crossplane had, or in fact, we've still got it in the code base, but it's due for removal in the next release. We had sort of a bunch of as type that many of you might have used, for example. So recently we sort of thought, all right, we're going to focus Crossplane on more of this sort of infrastructure type of thing, and we're going to integrate really well with areas of Crossplane like OAM or even other app models, rather than focus on Crossplane doing applications strictly as a first class thing itself, as the core Crossplane as opposed to OAM. So all of that leads up to, originally we designed the composition functionality to actually with the idea of supporting both applications and infrastructure. So in Crossplane 0.12 and 0.11, I believe, the way you would create a composite resource was by writing an infrastructure definition, which was such named to distinguish it from writing an application definition, which was something we plan to add at some point in the future. We scrapped those plans to introduce application definition. We kind of liked it as it was going, and we found a sort of a different way to cover applications, as I mentioned, via like provide a Helm, and maybe in future provide a customize, provide Kubernetes, provide any other way to deploy workloads. So in this release, we decided, after talking to the community a little bit and getting some feedback, we decided that since we were talking about composite resources all the time, the thing that defines a composite resource should be a composite resource definition. There's symmetry here with Kubernetes, where Kubernetes has a custom resource that is defined by a custom resource definition. Because of the C overlapping and the acronyms being the same there, CRD and CR, and because the cross in Crossplane sounds a little bit like an X, we're going with XR and XRD for composite resource and composite resource definition. The final part of this puzzle is that previously we had a separate type called an infrastructure publication, which sort of said, if you're an SRE and you've written you've written your composite resource definition to say, hey, there's this new type of composite resource. We explain this in some detail in the docs, but those composite resources are cluster scoped. The idea being that they exist above any namespace. They might be a VPC or something that wants to be shared across multiple namespaces. But then you can basically say, I would actually like to offer this to my application peers, the people who run the applications who work within a namespace in a cluster rather than working out the cluster scope. And we used to actually say, well, you could publish a requirement to those folks so that you could publish a namespace proxy type for the composite resource. And that namespace proxy type was always called something requirement. So if your composite resource was called foo, your requirement was called foo requirement. We changed that around. We've reintroduced our original claim terminology to replace that. So we're calling that a composite resource claim, the namespace thing. And you can call it whatever you want now. So you can call your, Acme company SQL database. You can define that as a composite resource and call that composite database. And then you can define a claim for it that's just called database if you would like. And that allows you as an SRE to present a type to your users that just seems like a database, not a database something or a database claim or whatever. They can just logically think of it as this is the database. So they don't need to think too much about there being a composite resource behind it or it being made up of Cloud SQL instances or whatever. At least, if things are operating well, they don't need to know those things. So in summary, infrastructure publication is gone and merged into composite resource definition. Composite resource definition is basically the sum of infrastructure definition and infrastructure publication. It's all in one thing now. Otherwise, it will look very familiar to people who are used to infrastructure definitions, basically the same. And requirements are now called claims and could be of whatever kind you would like. I think that's about the long version of it.
Cool. Thanks, Nick, for those details there. And then, as you're touching on there too, that those changes in the experience and the types for utilizing composition is what we expect the API to going towards 1.0 will be. So we expect that this API will remain, somewhat stable at least, and getting to a place where we can call this a V1, beta 1, or moving towards V1, and be all the expectations that come along with that.
Yeah, my goal, no promises at this point, but I can't currently see, and I don't think any of us can currently see any features that we have on the roadmap that would require us to make breaking changes. We have a lot of buy-in from all the stakeholders within Upbound, at least, and from the community members that we've talked with, that indicate we don't need to make breaking changes to the API. And our tentative goal is to pretty much rev everything to V1 beta 1 by the next release to sort of commit to it. So we've got one more release of just like, whoops, maybe something we completely missed, needs to make a breaking change. We don't expect that to happen. And then as long as that doesn't happen, we'll go V1 beta 1 next release.
That sounds like a good segue then to talk about the next release. Phil, looks like you made a couple updates here to add the roadmap in and such for 0.14 or 1.0, et cetera. Did you want to just have this as an informational link, or did you want to bring this up on your screen and share the roadmap maybe, or?
Yeah, definitely. I can share that real quick and then
okay.
let Nick go over the 0.14 board.
I'll stop share and you can start share, I think.
Okay, cool. So several of us have been kind of iterating. Is that sharing the roadmap update?
Yeah, I can see it, Phil.
Okay, great. So several of us have been iterating on kind of some draft roadmap things here. If you look at the overall 2020, we're trying to get to, at least for Crossplane Core, a 1.0 candidate by end of year. And so that includes the composition, basically getting to at least a V1 beta 1 or higher. For kind of production usage, as well as having the package manager, have the new capabilities. A lot of them are already there. Some fine tuning, some robustness enhancements, that type of thing will probably be coming. But having used it hands on, it's already pretty solid. So pretty happy with that. The other major thrust is really getting to 90% coverage for all the cloud providers. And so Casey's been doing a tremendous amount of work on, getting the stateless Terraform providers wrapped and creating a code gen pipeline around that, specifically for clouds that don't have a code gen pipeline. And then we're working with both the ACK and the Azure service operator team to adapt their code gen pipelines, and they're basically driving that, and we're helping them with that. And so we can touch on that a little bit more here in a minute. And then with Ohm in the 0.13 release, as I'm sure Nick mentioned, we basically have a subchart that's been there for just a little bit, and that's now installable as an option off of the main Crossplane Helm chart. And that additional features have been coming in with health scopes and a bunch of bug fixes. And there was a nice tweet that went out the other day that had kind of like the 0.11, I believe, kind of release notes in there to kind of see what's been going on there. So a lot of good progress on that. We kind of already covered the 0.13, but for 0.14, I don't know, Nick, if there's anything on here that you didn't touch on that we want to mention briefly.
We didn't go into any detail yet about what we're going to do in. Oh, sorry, hang on. You're talking about going over via.
Yeah, so, I think you covered the XRD. Yeah. We have like a new lint command, I think, that is available. Although I haven't actually seen that command surface in the crank tool yet, so maybe that just moved behind the scenes.
Yeah, I will just reiterate again, just to make sure people are prepared for it. There were some more deprecations in v0.13, specifically all the workload stuff, as I mentioned, Kubernetes application, Kubernetes target, Kubernetes application resource, and the core Crossplane Kubernetes provider. Are all deprecated in v0.13 and are likely to be removed in the next release in v0.14. We also did a small tweak. One of the new package types is actually called provider, as in you declaratively install a provider. We used to have, we still do, but it's deprecated. Each provider had a type called provider, like provider.aws, provider.gcp, et cetera, .crossplane.io, that configured the provider. We've replaced those with the type called provider config now to make it a little bit clearer what that does. And so that provider type is marked deprecated and likely to be removed in the next release as well. So just as a heads up, those are the two things coming down the pipeline. There's no, I would say that if any of you would be severely put out by those being removed in the next release, please let us know and we can leave them in for another release or so afterwards.
Oh, so you're saying that Kubernetes app and target and cluster didn't actually get removed yet, but it will be in 0.14.
Yeah, exactly. So those are marked deprecated. So they were not removed in 0.13. But we announced that we are going to remove them because we didn't remove them without notice, if possible. And as I say, we'll take them out in the next release unless anyone really wants us to leave them in for maybe one extra release.
Yep. Awesome. Okay. So that's basically like 0.13 and kind of what's coming down the pipe. So claim update propagation, bidirectional patching for status, composition revisions. Whether or not this actually lands in late October or the following release is still up for a little bit of discussion, just regards to how much is going to be focused on like provider acceleration versus some of that. But I think, Nick, you were saying that at least getting the claim update propagation will be likely. In this time.
Yeah, late October's not very far off at this point, so this is all, we're thinking we'd like to do a release in late October, and basically whatever we can do. Yeah. It might be a really big patch release for 0.13.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's some additional stuff as we're going to 1.0 that may get bumped to the following release, but this is kind of moving towards 1.0, going into KubeCon, getting things basically polished off for that. But 0.13 feels pretty good where we're at right now, with the exception of maybe the claim update propagation. Bidirectional patching for status would be really nice, but it's probably not super critical for late October. And then, the provider helm that we're using in some of our, configuration packages that basically kind of post-configure a provisioned like EKS cluster as an example, with some helm charts to land, the trimmings that you might want on that. And then we're targeting having at least a couple Crossplane resources be generated for each of by ACK pipeline and the Azure ASO pipeline. So that's kind of work in flight. And then also for Ohm, in discussion with Ryan, basically taking the Ohm APIs to V1 beta 1, and they might look very similar, exactly the same as the alpha ones. And so they did have some questions about how to provide an upgrade path. And so, I guess we'll talk about that briefly here in the next thing for 0.15. In terms of conversion of webhooks to support installing multiple API versions at the same time. And so that's kind of the one caveat there. But if we get that, and then validation webhooks for composition is another thing that's kind of been requested. And that is looking like it might get us to a 1.0 candidate. So we're not saying for sure that we'll be releasing 1.0 end of December, but I think the target here is that we're getting to 1.0 in that time frame. And then also all of the code gen should be turning on in this time frame. And they'll be alpha, right? So we're not like saying we're going to have co-generated, beta 1 APIs at that point, but they will be generated to like the equivalent of the V1 beta 1 quality doc. But just wanting to, reserve the right to, transition those to beta 1 after they've had a little bit of sit time. So that basically takes us through end of the year. And then some of the things that, we had, kind of pushed out till, like a January timeframe was custom composition. That's kind of, still going in the background, and we'll still probably keep that alive, but not just dedicate a huge amount of time to that for use with CDK8s and other types of templating beyond the built-in templating. And then some other package manager enhancements, some CRR enhancements for code gen, and then just getting to more coverage kind of in that January timeframe. So yeah, that's kind of roughly, these are drafts, so they're not finalized yet, but maybe Nick, you could take us through the 0.14 board and go over kind of what's coming down the pipe for late October.
Are you sure we want to do that now? The V0.14 board has not been groomed yet. It is very rough. It's everything that we could possibly have done in V0.14. So I imagine that it might take maybe the rest of this meeting to go through that board at this point.
Yeah, I think we probably, unless there's anything you want to cover on the slide here, maybe we could just skip over that.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to spend the rest of this meeting doing planning for the.
No. I'm just saying, well, if you want to move on to the next topic, not covering the 0.14 board, is there anything on this slide that you want to cover before we move on?
No, I'm good.
All right, cool.
Well, yeah, thanks, Phil, for the roadmap perspective there, especially across the next couple of releases, and as we make the final steps towards a 1.0 release. So that's good to have a bit of a picture of what we're what are the issues that we feel are the critical ones for getting to that stability and maturity to declare 1.0. So thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna go ahead and share the agenda documents again here. Okay, so that was like roadmap and theme and focus areas, and we kind of touched on a potential release schedule for 0.14 as well. Like a late October release would be nice, but it's almost mid-October now, so we might need to be a little realistic there. And so functionality or depending on scope, but fixes, especially issues or fixes that are not quite working with functionality that was released in 0.13, we definitely should consider some patch releases to get that functionality out so that folks that are depending on it or consuming it can get that out if a 0.14 release isn't quite in the cards for an end of month time frame. So we kind of play that by ear, and with things that we are hearing reported or things that are being demanded or requested, we can make a decision about what vehicle to ship those with. Cool. Anything else on milestones and releases and roadmap? If not, we can move on to the community topics section. Mr. Hashdan, tell us about the recent awesome episode you did last week with Sourcecraft.
Well, it was recent and awesome. It was a good show. The CTO of SourceGraph was on. He's really insightful, and there's a lot of information in there actually about SourceGraph, mostly because I was just kind of super interested about how things work behind the scenes. So if you're interested in how code search works, there's some really cool stuff there. We also, one of the reasons why we had SourceGraph on the show was because they recommend using Kubernetes as the deployment target, I guess you could say, for SourceGraph, whether you're deploying the open source project or you're doing it, you're using their enterprise proprietary version, which has like SSO stuff and things like that. And so we looked at that a little bit. And so we looked at their deployment manifests, which one of the things we covered in it was that they used just kind of raw Kubernetes manifests as opposed to using like a Helm chart or customize or something like that. And we looked at using new Crossplane features. This was the day before the release, so we were kind of giving a preview of it. We looked at using some of the Crossplane features to package up backing infrastructure as a configuration package. So generally, when you deploy SourceGraph, it will create a Postgres database and 2 Redis clusters running in your Kubernetes cluster. So they're just being created as deployments. You can also override that with your own infrastructure backing if you want to use like RDS or Cloud SQL or Cloud Memory Store and that sort of thing. So we showed doing that, but with actually deploying those with Crossplane instead of spinning those up and then kind of manually providing the credentials. And it was pretty straightforward. We basically just created a configuration package that had a SourceGraph infra XRD, and that created just a Postgres database in this case, but we talked about how it could have the Redis clusters as well. And then we showed how you could use that with a backing composition that was GCP or AWS or Azure, et cetera. And then we talked about potentially expanding that further and putting basically all of SourceGraph into a configuration package, right? So you could have those deployments in line and that sort of thing. And it would be especially easy even right now if it was a Helm chart to go ahead and package that up. So it's overall a pretty cool demonstration. You get to see some of the power of the new package manager and that sort of thing throughout it. So yeah, we ended up deploying SourceGraph and getting a live running instance, and we're hoping to also make that something that's documented in the SourceGraph documentation, because they currently it's a little bit of stumbling for folks to deploy it with infrastructure on cloud providers as opposed to running in cluster. So overall, really, really cool conversation.
Nice. And then, Dan, it looks like we already have our next guest lined up for TBS episode 24.
Yep. And I don't think Krish is on this call today, but he's been doing some great work on provider AWS. And he also got the Cli operator, or however you say that, I never know exactly, but basically Red Hat's kind of OCI registry project. The operator running with Crossplane. It's kind of similar to what I was just saying with SourceGraph, where it has some backing cloud infrastructure that you can use or you can deploy in cluster. So we are going to look at the work he did with that to make it compatible, which one of the things we'll highlight is it was actually a pretty straightforward effort on his part to get that working with Crossplane. So that should be pretty cool. And we might actually make some changes to that over the next week or so with the new version of Crossplane out and see if we can package up the Cli operator itself. So should be good.
Nice. It's exciting that Krish will be on a guest on the show too, because I know Krish has been doing a ton of good work, on the provider AWS and getting buckets towards beta 1 and stuff like that. So that's great to have him there. And did the rawcode.live, did that already happen today?
No, that should be 10:13. Now it is. So tomorrow, this is kind of David McKay, who's a developer advocate at now Equinix Metal, but previously Packet. He has a live stream show and wanted to have us on to chat about kind of the new things in Crossplane 0.13, as well, just kind of explain the value of Crossplane to him and that sort of thing. And as part of that, we'll be showing off the Packet provider is being transitioned to the Equinix Metal provider. So we'll be, incorporating that through our presentation.
Awesome, Dan. That's exciting to have another opportunity to for you to be a guest this time. I guess not be in the driver's seat this time. Cool. Congratulations, Dan. All right. So then KubeCon North America is coming upon us. I think it's about a month away or so. The 17th, November 17th, I think is when it starts. There are 2 talks I know of related to Crossplane that got accepted. Dan's talk about building an enterprise control plane on Kubernetes. Is that with who's that with, Dan? Is that with Stephen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Nice. Congratulations to Stephen as well. Stephen's on the call.
Yep. Thank you.
Cool. So that'd be a great talk. And then Winterflow and I got a talk that accepted on kind of Crossplane and Ohm. But ours is actually a tutorial format, which I have never done before. So I need to understand what the requirements of that are, but I think it's more of a practical, hands-on, like step-by-step sort of thing, as opposed to conceptual. So that might be interesting. I think it's like an 85-minute thing too. So it's a longer session too. So you can kind of walk people through how to really do something interesting. So that'd be fun. I think the dates to have talks recorded and published, I think is a little unreasonable this time, because they just announced like less than 2 weeks ago, what talks were accepted. And then I think the date that they published for the recordings being completed is like a week away or something like that, which is really quite ridiculous. So I think I personally am going to push back a little bit on that, and I'm not going to break my back to come up with an entire talk and have it recorded and stuff within a week. Dan, feel free to, I don't know, maybe you and Steven are ahead of it more than I am, and you guys are already done. But feel free to push back a little bit too, or if you need to as well. I don't think it's quite reasonable this time.
Yeah. Also, ours is a tutorial format as well. So
it is.
If you want to discuss the requirements of that, happy to do it. I mean, I'm just probably getting the same information you are, but we can see what's desired there.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. Cool. So we have 2 tutorial sessions. Interesting. Nice. Okay. And then Nick and Harry, I think your all's talk about composition got waitlisted. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything back since it was waitlisted, so I'm assuming, it would be very little time, as you said, for us to react if they told us it was not waitlisted now.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. I didn't hear any other talks that were accepted or waitlisted, but people can holler if they know of one.
I think the talk from Luke and me is also waitlisted.
Oh, cool, Jan. That's awesome. Congratulations on that.
Yeah, not sure what that means, but is like every talk who wasn't accepted waitlisted?
No, they do some explicit rejections as well. My other talk, Jan, got completely rejected. It said there's no room for it and it's not happening. So waitlist is a distinct category.
I see. Okay. Oh well.
Yeah, see if maybe there will be news that it moves into accepted, but then just like all the other talks, it doesn't leave a ton of room to do preparation and recording and stuff. But we can make it happen if it needs to. Awesome, cool. And then so the CNCF project pavilion. That was not typed correctly. CNCF project pavilion. We signed up for a booth and the office hours again this time. One of the really good things here is that the booth from KubeCon EU will be all the materials and design and everything that we did for it will be copied over to the booth for the next KubeCon here, the NA one. So the setup work will be fairly limited since a lot of it will already be done and there's no ramping up on the platform since we figured it out for last KubeCon. So that should be fairly low touch, I think. We can kind of discuss a little bit maybe about how best we want to try to engage with the community since it had somewhat limited results last time, but just having the presence there and having, the Crossplane logo and it's like the materials and links and stuff for people that do cruise through to click on. It's just more traffic and more eyes on the project. And I think that the cost to us this time is less than it was last time. So I think that's a fair trade-off to at least have our name up there and out there. There's only 5 projects that get that for the entire CNCF this time. And we were fast enough to get in there and be accepted. So we'll be one of only 5 CNCF projects with our logo and stuff in the booth there. So it seems like that would be reasonable eyes on it for anybody that goes to the Project Pavilion. They'll only see us and 4 other people, 4 other CNCF projects. So that sounds good. Okay, cool. So that was, I think I didn't cross off this stuff. Dan, these are the 2 issues for you. These are old stuff, right? These are copy paste.
No, I added those in.
Oh, okay. This one is copy paste then for me last time. Sorry. Okay, cool. So were there any PRs or any particular code things that need to be brought up right now, or any other community issues? I know we've got a number of folks on the call today. So if there's anything related to the Crossplane and the community here, well, you're more than welcome to bring it up right now. All right. Cool. So then that would be everything in the agenda that is for the general audience. We do have a remaining section that is an optional section for us to get into some deeper technical discussions that may kind of wind through some paths there that everyone might not be interested in. So anyone who wants to go ahead and hop off the call now or while we're getting into some of these discussions is more than welcome to. And with that, Dan, I will give you the floor.
Cool, thanks. I think the main thing I wanted to talk about here was the configuring providers. And I think a few of the community members who are on the call today, I've talked to a little bit about this. But basically, there are a variety of issues open, and this kind of older issue as well, that describe installing or the process of installing a provider and what you can change about basically the deployment of the controller for that provider. So previously, in the old package manager, we'd package an install.yaml file with the provider package, and it would basically have a deployment manifest in it, and we'd take it, but then kind of like patch over some fields of it and be opinionated about how we want it to look. Or you could run the package manager with a flag that basically said, just let whatever the package says happen for the deployment. So that was kind of like an insecure mode. So the issue with that is it usually doesn't make sense for the package author to determine how you want your package to be installed. And there may be, a variety of different ways that a single provider controller should be run depending on the environment. So a great example of that would be with AWS. If you're running an EKS cluster, you might want to use IAM roles for service accounts, which involves setting an FS group on the deployment. However, if you're running in something like OpenShift, they actually don't allow you to set an FS group. They randomly assign one to your deployments. So it actually would fail to run in the versions that we had that install.yaml written in that way. So obviously you want to be able to, choose what you want for that value based on where you're installing. However, there's also some security boundaries around that, just like how we had before. So we don't want you to always be able to say, please run this thing with root access to do whatever it wants, or with, arbitrary configuration of resource limits and that sort of thing. So we're trying to think about what the appropriate bounds are around configuring providers. And we don't want to introduce kind of like a subset of a deployment that continues to grow over time to eventually just be equivalent to a deployment. But we also don't want to provide something that's so minimal that doesn't allow you to do the things that you need to do. So basically the way that we're approaching it, given those goals in mind, is just seeing what people want to do with provider deployments and see if we can develop a model to make that, possible safely. So if you have any thoughts around that, please feel free to drop comments on that issue or just reach out in Slack as we kind of work towards we're going to configure those. I think the leading idea right now would be well, this is probably actually just speaking for me, so I shouldn't say the leading idea from a whole community perspective, but my kind of forefront thought is that we should probably allow some sort of arbitrary configuration and then have gates on the package manager that control how you're allowed to pass in arbitrary configuration. I'm a little worried if we don't allow arbitrary configuration that we're just going to keep running into use cases that we didn't consider at first and keep having to modify things. So that's what my thought process is right now. So if you have thoughts that agree or disagree with that, I'd definitely love to hear them.
Yeah, just chiming in with my current thinking on this, which is maybe similar to yours, Dan. So for context for the community, part of the reason that we don't necessarily want to, and I'm not sure if Dan just said this, but part of the reason that we don't want to have just an entire deployment spec potentially associated with a provider CR is because there are some situations where you, upbound cloud being a big one, where you could submit a provider to be installed and you're installing it on someone else's infrastructure basically, and they don't want you to have full control over how the deployment is run and how many resources it has and all these other things. So one way that I could see to do that is that we optimize for the primary open source use case where potentially you are okay with the folks who are authoring providers, which will often be sort of infrastructure operator SRE types expanding Crossplane. You're okay with them having a say over like what nodes the provider controller runs on or how many resources it has or what environment variables are injected into it. But then we would need some way to lock that down. And one thing we've spoken about in the past is just having a flag which says, hey, this can be turned on or can't be turned on, which I think would be a step in the right direction, but I worry would not be granular enough. So my thinking at the moment is something more along the lines of, if we wanted to do it ourselves, something a little bit similar to like pod security policy, like provider security policy that like was a separate resource that configured what you can and can't do when installing a provider. Or if we wanted to take a more modern approach, maybe just recommending using OPA or something like that to restrict what can be done on a provider.
Yeah, I think that sounds really good. I would bias towards using OPA for sure, as that's becoming a little more ubiquitous and is less resources and controllers for us to manage.
Did you say, sorry, Dan, I think it was you that mentioned as well that upstream Kubernetes was considering moving towards OPA instead of having their own security policies and things like that, right?
Yep.
So by OPA, do you mean that we will allow arbitrary deployment spec and let the policy restrict the ones that you can or cannot put there?
That's what I'm thinking, but take this with a huge grain of salt. I have never personally used OPA, so I could be completely wrong about how OPA works. My thinking would be we would need a sane default, such that if someone just didn't want to tell us all the details about the deployment, we would just like, you should be able to submit what you could submit today. It will give you a sane default deployment. But I think to Dan's point, it's probably going to be a losing game if we are like, VO.14 allows you to set NVARs, and then someone's like, actually, I want to mount a volume, and then VO.15 allows you to mount a volume, and then someone's like, oh, actually, I want to do this. Like, yeah. I could imagine us having like a deployment spec template or something like that eventually that you could optionally fill out to just have access to everything, but we would need a way to, allow the Crossplane administrator to restrict what can be done with that.
Got it. Yeah. So the like mechanically, OPA would prevent creation of the provider kind with details that you don't want them to add, right? So it will basically prevent the creation of provider instead of the creation of the deployment itself.
Yeah, which I think is a better user experience to sort of upfront be, rather than say, yep, we created the provider and now it's not going to work, to just say, no, sorry, like this is not allowed on the provider.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. It's like, offloading the configuration policy CR to OPA, which is something, well maintained already. So yeah, I like this idea.
Would we embed the complete schema for deployment specs inside of our provider spec, or would there be another way to specify the deployment outside of the provider structure?
I mean, I haven't designed this, so I can't say for sure. But my personal naive thinking was we would, yes, just have an optional like deployment spec template that if specified started overriding what our default was. I don't know if Dan feels differently.
Yeah, no, that seems fine to me. I mean, you could always have a, a reference to like a config map or something like that. In this case, I don't really see a bunch of value of that because we would just be losing out on upfront validation because it would just be a bag of YAML kind of on there. So
yeah, I remember we used to have that deployment spec under the, I guess it was a cluster package install. No, it was a cluster package resource. There is some caveats there with the like deployment spec template being like huge, so we might not like need all of the properties.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with it, is if we try to replicate the deployment spec schema into our provider schema, it kind of blows it out and becomes a thing that we have to maintain. So I wanted to think about it. Anyways, we can obviously design it later, but I like the general approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just literally embed the deployment spec, like the struct itself, from upstream Kate. So
yeah, we could probably also there's an increasing. Yeah, we could probably also avoid doing the whole deployment spec, I would imagine, and just have a pod spec template that the deployment uses, which is a pretty common pattern these days. A lot of folks, like they have I think the Knative people talk about the concept of pod specable, which is just a duck type of anything that has a pod spec template in it. And as Dan says, I imagine that, we could just pick apps v1 from upstream and just put that in there. I think it would definitely blow out our CRD docs and things like that. So anyone looking at the documentation schema of this type would see 10 times as much stuff that was all optional. So, but which is less than ideal. But I don't think it would be a huge maintenance burden for us or anything. And actually, I don't know, we could also consider, if we really did think that was a problem, we could always consider having like an alternative, custom provider CR or something. I'm not sure we would want to go that way, but that's one way to sort of keep it separate.
And I think JSON schema, you can also ref something by URL. So maybe we could ref the official Kubernetes schema externally somehow.
Yeah, wouldn't we just use the dependency? Cool. Jared, I don't know if you're still here, but
the next item, sir, is I'm allowing you to take control.
Cool. All right, sounds good. The last one here, I was wondering if Tim, who kind of requested this, was going to be on the call, is the main reason I added it, but maybe we could discuss it a little bit anyway. Basically, Tim wants to be able to replicate resources across basically across different provider configs. That's a bit of a simplification, I guess, or maybe that's kind of like what my interpretation of the implementation would look like. But I think the main use case is he wants to replicate resources across a Kubernetes cluster, across Kubernetes clusters. So that could be like a Helm provider config or something like that. And so, that could be as simple as literally just having like some sort of controller that's completely separate from Crossplane, which is kind of what I've recommended for expediency, to be able to just say, when you see the creation of this type of resource, please create one of them for each of this other type of resource. But then there's also the potential to have some sort of like composition set or something like that, that allows you to say, when I create an instance of this XRD, or when I create an XR, I guess, create one for each of these provider configs I reference or something like that.
So Dan, would this be like, instead of having 10 instances of the XR, that you would just have one instance of the XR that would in turn create effectively 10 instances of the XR, into these different clusters? It just seems like if you wanted to.
I don't think so. There's no like, this isn't like that there's Crossplane on the remote host. This is just literally like everything just exists in one cluster, right? So it's not like
Yeah.
a pull model or anything like that. It wouldn't be
Right.
creating an instance of the XR in the remote or anything like that.
Right. So if we just had a single control cluster, and then we just wanted to basically put all the things that were needed for like an EKS plus a database or whatever it was going to be into a composition, then I could just create 10 instances of that and get 10 EKS clusters with database and Helm installs and all that stuff, right?
Yep.
So it sounds like we're looking at, you know, in your Git repo, you know, you have your configuration package with the composition in there. And then what he's saying is that instead of having 10 files that say cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3 are all instances of this, that I want to just have one that says, you know, inside of the composition, it says I have cluster 1, 2, 10, you know.
Yeah.
So it just feels like pretty arbitrary. Like what's the benefit of cramming that into a composition instead of just having 10 separate YAML files for each cluster?
I think I can see the case either way. I mean, you know, you could make the same argument for pods in Kubernetes, you know, and deployments, like why have a replica set when you could just make 10 pods manually, sort of thing. I think, on the other hand, I am not sure if I want to commit to, you know, I don't think we're going to have much time to, but this isn't in our roadmap at the moment. I think it would be a really interesting thing to look at as an experimental add-on to Crossplane. I think to Dan's point, I could see, I don't think we'd want to build this as a feature of composition itself, as in the current composite resource controllers, but I could see us building a layer on top of this. You can imagine that perhaps when you create an XRD that defines the database composite resource, we could have a separate controller that's also watching for XRD and that automatically creates the database set composite resource. And if you create a database set, it basically has the same schema as a database, or it has a database spec template, same as a pod. And then it has a number of replicas as well. And then it just goes and creates those 10 things for you, and you can change it to 9 and it'll kill one of them, or change it up to 10 and or 11 and it'll add another one. I think all of that could be built as an experimental controller without breaking API changes on top of what we're doing at the moment. So I'm feeling about this that like it's worth having an issue to track, and maybe mentioning that it's like, you know, my dog, help wanted issue or something like that. But unless we get sort of multiple customers asking for it, I don't know if it's going to be a priority with all the other things we've got at the moment. So it'd be good to take people's temperature and see if anyone else like really wants this. I think, you know, reading between the lines, basically this is supposed to be sort of, this is something that I think Tim wants to use to, sorry, is it Tim? Did I get the name right? Yeah. Yep. Wants to use to replace Kubernetes application, right? So you could have a Helm chart that gets scheduled out to end clusters or whatever. But you could argue that it could also be, you know, you have 20 Google accounts and you want to create a VPC that looks the same in each Google account or something like that. There's a sort of an extraction of a thing there. So I think I'm kind of seeing both sides. I could see this being useful to some people, and I can see a path to doing it, but also I don't know if we're going to have time to work on it unless it's something that proves to be really in demand from the community.
I mean, in that case where you want a VPC in each Google account, couldn't you create a composition that was like, here's the content that I want, here's the VPC, here's the, you know, the CIDR for the subnets in it, and like go and apply this thing consistently everywhere? Like what are we lacking today? Like that would prevent him from just doing that and applying it consistently, is it?
Well, let's say you had, what if you were creating new accounts all the time? And like, so every time you had to go and be like, all right, and I'd also like to create an instance of this thing in this thing. Like, you know, you could potentially have it like dynamic where, you know, when you add a new cluster, it automatically gets these things deployed onto it, that sort of thing. I think it's just like around automation and that sort of thing. You obviously can create, you know, multiple instances of them, but I think the ideal use case here is not one where you're creating like the new cluster with, or the new account or whatever with Crossplane, right? You're like bringing it in, and you just would like, you know, for maybe some labels on that provider config to say like, please put linker D in here or whatever. But I mean, you're right that you could totally do it the other way and, you know, just deploy it again. And so, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be super interesting to see kind of like alternatives considered and why like he feels those are not good, and that this is like a pressing need. I just think I'm kind of missing that part that would potentially bump it up in priority.
I feel like part of this is also because it's arguably a regression in Crossplane, right? Like this is ticking some boxes for folks where we basically supported scheduling workloads before, and for a long time promoted that as a core tenet of Crossplane, and then recently have focused and sort of said that scheduling workloads is not really a priority for us, sort of thing. So I can see some of the, I know the history here with Tim specifically, where basically he wanted to use Kubernetes workloads for that, and we said Kubernetes applications that we said sorry, they're deprecated, use Helm, and then he was like, how do I schedule this to multiple clusters? And we were like, well, you can't. So I see your point that you can just do it manually, but that's also, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the best possible user experience.
Right. So what would be the
same with pods? You can manually schedule them too, but they still build a lot of high-level things around them to make it easier.
Well, what would be the gap? Like, so we can do Helm charts today inside of the composition, and that can basically plumb down any arbitrary YAML. So, like, what's the gap that we have in terms of the app scheduling?
So you would just have to create a Helm chart for everything you wanted. It's like you have to create an instance of that every time you wanted that Helm chart to go somewhere, as opposed to just saying like, please, I know I have like a bunch of, it would be a Helm provider config in this case. Sorry, Tim actually just messaged me. I'd like for this thing, like, please create this on all clusters, right? As opposed to saying like, let me list all my clusters. Let me now create an instance of this for each of them that reference the right provider config, which obviously you could automate that out of cluster with like, a for loop.
Okay.
But that's definitely the use case. And he just messaged me, so I'm going to see if he can actually jump on right now.
Oh, cool. So it'd be kind of like saying, hey, match these, labels, and then just apply all this config to anything that happens to have that label.
Yeah, I think it's effectively what we envisioned for our workload scheduling, right? We talked about, we had clusters. Our workloads never could be scheduled to multiple clusters. Like they would just, pick the right cluster for this one thing. So I imagine that, like, we had thought that the next step would be, okay, go run this workload on N clusters, and we just never got the scheduler above the point where it just randomly picked one cluster based on label selectors.
Right. Okay.
I like, this is something the community is asking for, so I think we should at least, consider it and see how it goes. But I also don't think that necessarily needs to be on the roadmap for V1.0 or anything like that.
Oh yeah, for sure. He said he's not able to make it, but I said we'd have a recording for him. So, he knows what he wants, right? So we've kind of explored our thoughts on it. So hopefully he can give some more context and maybe pop in Slack and let us know. But yeah, I definitely don't think that this is something that like, basically I agree with Nick that this can be done at higher level abstractions. So I would not recommend, as we're trying to stabilize APIs, to try and jam this in.
Sounds good.
Cool. Sounds good then. That's any other thoughts on that before we wrap up the topic? All right. Well, that's everything that was on the agenda for today. So I think then we can go ahead and adjourn, and we'll see everybody online.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared.
All right. See y'all.
Happy Monday.
Thanks. Bye.